Well, thank you very much, everyone, for joining us today as we talk about fast and compliant CI/CD pipelines in the financial industry. My name is Bob Walker. I'm the field CTO at Octopus Deploy, and joining me today is a very special guest, Phil Holleran, the field CTO at GitHub. Phil, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well this morning, Bob. Thanks for asking. Glad to be
Oh,
here.
oh, thank you for joining us. I'm really excited to have you here as well because I I might be asking you to do kind of a live review of my CI/CD pipeline as we go through this today.
Sounds good.
Awesome. So, in terms of an outline, what to expect. So, we're going to have a bit of a conversation. We're going to talk a bit about what we hear as the current challenges with audit and compliance. Then, we're going to talk a bit about how GitHub and Octopus Deploy can help you with auditing and compliance. And then finally, on the back half of this webinar, expect a demo of a CI/CD pipeline where we leverage GitHub and Octopus Deploy, obviously, with the two people that are here today. So let's jump right into the very first thing, which is what we hear as the current challenges with auditing and compliance. Now, when we talk about compliance, I do want to kind of align our understanding first. So, first up, you're going to have these controls. So think about developers; they can't deploy to production, or they can deploy to production, but only for their specific application. And then you have the reports, the provenance, the who, the what, when, where, why changes happened. And then you hand that off to your auditors who are actually making sure that you are following what you say you're doing, that you have the appropriate controls in place, that they're looking at the reports, they're doing all these necessary things. Now, I'm kind of curious, Phil, when you hear a customer mention compliance, is there anything else that jumps to mind out of these three things?
Nothing really beyond these three things, but I think, when I hear compliance, it's kind of like getting people to talk about their recipe for, like, let's say a chicken soup. Everyone kind of agrees on what the core things are, but it's all put together a little bit differently. So every organization has got this mix of their own compliance requirements and their interpretations of the standards that are coming down. And ultimately, what matters is that we can make sure that all of the necessary components ingredients are there for them to put together in the way that makes sense for their business and the way that their auditors or their other folks are expecting that to be delivered.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I remember uh, I'm thinking about PCI compliance as an example. It seems every company almost has their own interpretation of how they're quote unquote PCI compliant, even though there is a common set of rules and standards for that. But everyone kind of has their own little interpretation, their own little way of adding it. Like going back to your example, having a little bit of salt for each one of those.
Exactly.
Awesome. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the challenges that we see with auditing and compliance. The first one, reduced auditability, increased risk through the DYI CI/CD pipeline. This is kind of near and dear to my heart because I remember when I worked at a bank, when I first started, developers, we could deploy to dev and test, but we couldn't deploy to staging and production. That was the responsibility of the web admins. And so we had two completely separate CI/CD pipelines. Um, how we did how we deployed to dev and test was vastly different than how we deployed to staging and production. In fact, um, this was a bit wild. We actually used SharePoint workflows and web deploy to deploy to staging and production, if you can only imagine that. So, as you can
Oh
imagine,
goodness.
oh my gosh, I know that's crazy, isn't it? And, and you can imagine when we went to production, it was a bit of a train wreck at times because sometimes things wouldn't run how we expected them to run because although we ran them in dev and test, we didn't really run them the same way in staging and production. And so we had production outages and we had all of these different things that would pop up after we did a deployment. And so bank being a bank, they said, okay, you have to stop deploying as frequently. We can't have these production outages all the time. You need to have all of these sign-offs. And in their mind, they're thinking, we're going to reduce risk. But in fact, we actually substantially increased risk because if we're deploying once a quarter, which we ended up doing, you got to think about all of the changes that are going to be going out there for one particular deployment, all the different ways something could go wrong, all the different ways the data could interact with your code base that maybe you hadn't tested before. So even then, we actually increased risk even more. So I'm kind of curious, Phil, have you ever seen something like that where in your efforts to reduce risk, you actually end up substantially increasing risk?
I think what you said is a perfect example because not only that, you lose the muscle memory and kind of the organizational memory of just doing that so often that you know what to do each step of the way. And I think also beyond that, a really heavy-handed interpretation of separation of duties tends to mean that not only maybe do you not have the ability to deploy to production, but then you start hiding code from one another, and people lose visibility into how it gets to production, which then causes even more challenges. And a separation of who can actually complete the action is completely different than an understanding of how that action is completed. So that, I, in my role as a developer or as a platform engineer, can have complete visibility and understand how any changes I'm making in my role and my responsibility are going to be impacted by or affected by something somewhere else in the chain.
Now, I I have to ask, do you see that often where you see companies hiding code from other teams and how all these different things like that?
It seems to be a bit of a coin flip. And
Okay.
for me, it seems to be a bit of a pendulum swinging back and forth. Like eventually somebody realizes that, hey, we need to democratize, access to this, right? We need to at least make sure that people can see the code for the CI/CD pipeline. And then an audit finding that may not even be related comes in, and then suddenly there's this pendulum swing or an overreaction where well, we have to have complete separation, and devs can't know how things get deployed to production, and it's that kind of ebbing and flowing and that swinging back and forth. I think that gets people a lot. I've seen a lot of our customers experience a lot of whiplash in that. So what we're talking about today is really prescient because it aims to kind of hit that nice middle point of visibility and control while also making sure that we can have these auditable pipelines that can be relied upon and kind of standardized across business units and companies.
It's funny because that kind of leads us nicely in the next couple points, which is the manual steps that reduce efficiency and that lower traceability and manual reporting. I Speaking from experience, I've seen and I've also personally experienced situations where you have to fill out like a 50-page Word document even to deploy to QA, let alone when you get to staging and when you get to production. So it's this incredibly manual process that you end up having because of these kind of whiplash events where it's like, oh, developers, they had a lot of control. They could go and deploy all the way up to production, and then you had some sort of production outage and you whiplashed back and said, no, they can't have any control whatsoever. And we need to have all these manual steps. And
Well, yeah, or you've got to go and you've got to fill out a change request ticket, and then the one
yeah.
human who's allowed to approve it is on vacation, so you have to sit and wait a week or two to see if the changes that you've made are actually going to work or not, and then you're stuck waiting, and that's what contributes to continued delays and project delays and things not shipping on time.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And so, and then it comes back to even further delays because you have this lower traceability and you have all this manual reporting. Going back to that bank, you could imagine having two completely separate basic processes, how we went to dev and test and staging and production. The amount of time that we spent reconciling all this manual reporting and trying to prove to the auditors, yes, we are following this kind of very stringent separation of concerns. Look at all of the stuff we kind of put together. But that took time. And that just adds to that further delay. And it just reduces your deployment frequency even more. And do you have any, like, I guess, thinking through, like, in terms of the audit, on that auditing side, do you have any, like, interesting audit horror stories or anything along those lines?
We'll protect the innocent here, but when
Yeah.
maybe an audit success story to kind of go to the next point here, where the challenge that we often see, and I'm sure you see it too, is that lack of an enterprise-wide standardization process really leads and contributes back to that repeated. Hey, we've got to go and show all of these reports. We have to lead the auditor down the path for every single application that's out there, and it takes time and it's tedious. Where we have had customers have great success, though, is by creating that enterprise-wide standard, having a standard process that has to be followed, and then
Yeah.
they can show the auditor how that standardized process works, the steps that are involved in it, the controls that are there, and then they only need to demonstrate to that auditor that each application is being sent down this standardized process, and there isn't a way to circumvent it. So then we can work with the auditor to audit the process and demonstrate that the process is required across the portfolio of applications. And that becomes a much easier audit experience and a much less painful one.
Oh, yeah. I always kind of look at it when you don't have that standardization.
Yep.
Oftentimes, it's kind of like you go into the forest and kick over a log, and you see all the bugs kind of scramble. And we've actually had customers kind of like that, where they've come to us and they've said, we took a look and we can't believe what we're seeing. All these different tools and processes and ways we do these things. Like, we got to get some standardization, and that leads us to the next point, which is that kind of poor DevX that appears from this lack of standardization, because there's all of this just kind of, I say, the Wild West. And so there's all this high friction in order to get anything done due to this lack of trust. And I've, we've seen this happen where, developers, they'll join a company, and if it's a terrible experience, they're probably going to be starting looking for a new job pretty quickly. They're like, I don't really have to put up with this, unless there's, something that's anchoring them to that particular role.
Exactly. And it's that poor experience of, if I make a change, I want to know that it's actually going to have the intended impact, and I don't want to wait a week or two
Yeah.
or however long it might be to see if it's working or not, because it's going to take me a heck of a lot of time to get back in and figure out exactly what I was doing by the time that rolls back around and I actually get a deployment window and I can get out there, because I've moved on to two or three other things. And I mean, that just beyond the organizational frustration of not being able to feel like I can complete my job satisfactorily.
Yeah. I remember one time, we're finishing up a project, and I said, "Oh, how long are you going to spend testing this?" And they go, "Well, we budgeted a couple months for this." I'm like, "Oh my gosh!" It's like, I will have definitely moved on by the end of those 2 months, but it is what it is. And what's funny is that we often don't hear these specific things come up in conversations. Oftentimes, it's a question that we get asked. So we had a customer that came to us with an audit report where they said, "Hey, uh, we found out that some developers, they have the capability to turn off a very critical step to our process that actually handle a lot of the policies and making sure that everything was followed." And so they were kind of a little bit scared. And so so oftentimes we hear these different questions that pop up. I'm kind of curious, is there any question that you're seeing on the screen? You're probably seeing the screen for the first time in more detail. Anything that kind of pops up to you that you typically hear a lot more, or is there something that we're missing?
The one that I've been hearing a lot of our customers, specifically banks, being asked by their auditors lately is, how do I demonstrate a separation of responsibility or separation of duty?
Yeah.
And that's the one where, as I was kind of commenting earlier, everyone seems to kind of have their own interpretation of what that means, and the severity of it, and how that's ultimately implemented. And if I can think of a single dirty word on that, it's probably that separation of duty, because that falls back to like, hey, how do we ensure that all these other things that you were just talking about aren't occurring, that there isn't a way to circumvent that, the process has to be followed.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And that's a kind of, it's a very interesting thing that comes up, because yes, we often hear that same thing. And uh sometimes it's even to the absolute nth extreme that we end up coming across, where it's like, wow, you really have some separation of duties. It's like, doesn't have to be that extreme. And so let's move on a little bit to how GitHub and Octopus Deploy can help impact your auditing and compliance. Now that we've kind of heard about some of the common challenges. And so I want to talk a bit about kind of the ideal CI/CD pipeline when it comes to FSIs. And now there's some common things that we're not really going to spend too much time on, such as build once and deploy anywhere, meaning I'm not rebuilding for every single branch. And we have the RBAC controls and separation of duties. We've kind of talked about that quite a bit, as well as testing in prod-like and ephemeral environments. But some new things that have come up fairly, I'd say, in the last couple of years is really this concept of supply chain security, the vulnerability scanning, the SBOMs, the attestations, the provenance. We're going to talk about that a bit more, but really, I want to say what kind of kicked off this in earnest was that executive order 14028. And this is more impacting on, I imagine, on your side, Phil, less on our side. So I'm kind of curious, what have you seen as kind of fallout from that executive order?
I've seen a lot of people suddenly start knowing the term SBOM, but not a lot of people actually agreeing on what should be in there and how it should be created and what should be done with it afterward. It's this thing that we know that we have to do, and there are, a number of different standards out there for exactly how it should look and what we should put in there, and then we're stuck with yet another artifact. And there's really a lot of people still trying to figure out, like, how long do I hang on to this thing for? What do I do with it once I have it?
Yeah, actually, we actually had someone just Peter commented, what is Executive Order 14028? So Executive Order 14028 came about in 2021 from a bunch of basically supply chain attacks that occurred, most notably SolarWinds, where Russian attackers were able to gain access and they were able to start injecting this code into the supply chain. And so in response to that, Executive Order 14028 was created as a way to address the supply chain security amongst a number of other things that came about. It's actually quite long. I started reading and I'm like, wow, this is a lot longer than I was expecting. And so kind of coming back to that, I guess moving on to the next thing is another thing that this is again, this more near dear to my heart, which is the database deployments, automating your database deployments, which means including all the components as part of your ideal CI/CD pipeline. What I often will come across is developers and platform engineers will create this really awesome process to automate all of their code deployments and get everything up there. And then they have some sort of manual process for their database deployments because that's still the purview of DBAs because that's the separation of duties. Only DBAs can run scripts in production. And I'm kind of curious, Phil, are you seeing something similar or are there other components that people typically exclude from the CI/CD pipeline?
I'm largely still seeing it excluded too, specifically within the financial industry. But I think that's in part because of a lot of the age and legacy nature of a lot of those applications where the database was largely completely separate, where they're not using an object relation an ORM to manage that database. It's not being
Mm.
defined in code like you might be doing with Rails or something else like that. And then the movement to treat databases as code has really been something that's been bubbling for a while. There's a couple of really interesting projects around it, but again, where that's kind of been brought in is outside of the core applications and really more kind of anything that might be related to a front end website or something else like that that's not hitting the core systems in the back end, where a lot of those databases and controls are much older than the current generation of applications accessing them.
You'd be surprised how many customers we talk to who are asking questions about deploying to mainframes, including FSIs. They're still around, and they're still around. They're still incredibly popular, and they're rock solid. So yeah, let me get back to those core systems. So not just I'm thinking along with the database, but you also mentioned those core systems, is including those as well. And then finally on this slide is that separating this concept of separating deploying new versions from releasing new functionality. And so what I mean by that is that oftentimes the goal is to de-risk new functionality. And so what I've come across is a lot of folks asking me about how do we do blue-green style deployments? How do I do canary style deployments? And when I ask, I was like, okay, what are you trying to solve? And like, well, we're not quite sure if this new feature is going to work. I'm like, that's not really what blue-green deployments are for. That's not really what a canary deployment's for. Those types of deployments, they're really for de-risking whether or not the deployment will actually work. And you can run some sanity tests and some smoke tests just to make sure that, yes, the application is up and running and it's working and you're not noticing any sort of issues. But what you really need to do is separate that concept of deploying a new version of code from releasing new functionality by leveraging things like feature toggles. We can turn on and off toggles based on a particular group of people or this particular region or any number of different things. That allows you to have a lot more control. And so if anything does go wrong, you can also turn that toggle off and you're not quote unquote rolling anything back. You're just turning off that functionality. And so I imagine you probably don't hear about that as much on your side of the on your side of the CI/CD pipeline if we're thinking about GitHub and GitHub Actions, but I'm kind of curious if you're coming across anything similar, Phil.
Definitely are coming across it. That this is a practice that's been pretty common in kind of the technology native companies for quite some time that we see more and more banks wanting to adopt. I
Mm,
think the biggest barrier to adopting something like that is ultimately the stuff that we've been talking about, the slow deployment processes. And even if you're going to deploy out a new feature flag or a new toggle, if you've got that slow slogging process, it's going to still take a day, a week, 2 weeks, whatever your typical deployment path is to get that toggle out there. And then you've got to toggle that on and off. So kind of going checkboxes back here in kind of our ideal pipeline, those RBAC controls and separation of duties, we have seen a couple of customers start working more closely with their auditors
Mm,
to have more and more of those duty separations be not humans who are doing the things, but humans who define the policy, and then having automated checks through that pipeline to make sure that the policy set by XYZ division is 100% adhered to, so that it can move through the pipeline faster. So the separation of duty then becomes who gets to define the policy, who gets to maybe approve an exception to the policy where a human might need to be in the mix, but those policy gates get defined by the separate individuals or the separate responsibilities, which then allow for those changes to get at least into lower environments, dev, test, QA, whatever, much sooner, so that you can start taking advantage of more of these things like feature toggles and blue-green deployments to get an understanding of what the preferred implementation path is, or what's the more performant way of handling that particular piece of functionality.
I've noticed that as well, where oftentimes when someone asks about, I want canary or I want blue green style deployments, is they're also trying to hide this very manual process that does lead to a lot of these types of issues. And they don't have the appropriate, like what you said, the appropriate automation in place, the appropriate steps in place to allow for that and to make it super easy and super fast. If anyone's curious, I actually just released a new white paper this week or the last week. If you go to octopus.com/publications, talking about trunk-based deployments, these progressive delivery strategies like blue-green style, blue-green, canary, as well as leveraging feature toggles, because that's really kind of the triad on how to achieve a lot of those things. But ultimately, it also requires a lot of discipline on everyone's side, not just the platform engineer side, but the developers. They have to be very disciplined in their approach to make sure things, like your database changes are backwards compatible, that you adhere to the feature toggles and actually add them, and then also go back through and remove those feature toggles after you're done with them. So it's not just something I can just turn on like a light switch. It does require quite a bit of effort, but ultimately the rewards are still worthwhile. And so when we look at what does it look like with Octopus Deploy and GitHub, what it and this is kind of a very simplistic diagram, but we have the developer and they check into GitHub, that kicks off an action, that hands off to Octopus Deploy, and then that does the deployment to dev and test, as well as eventually getting up to production. And you can have those separation of duties however you want those duties to be. You can have it be, well, developers, they can deploy to dev and test, but they can't deploy to production. Or you can say, like we've said before, where developers, they can deploy to dev, test, and production, but only for their particular applications. Still require ITSM approvals, which we'll walk through in just a second and as part of the demo, and everything else in between. And so, you know, you see up here, I've harped on best in breed tools, or you see the label best in breed tools. In my mind, it's working with tools that are designed to do the thing that you're wanting it to do. So you're not trying to misuse a tool in a way. I can't tell you the number of times that I've seen a company try to misuse a tool just because it can do X, therefore it can do Y. So I'll give you a really good example on the Octopus Deploy side. When we added Git-based triggers, people are like, oh, you can monitor Git, so we can also use you as a build server. I'm like, please do not use us for that. That's not what we were designed for. So I'm kind of curious, Phil, are you seeing anything similar when it comes to those best in breed tool discussions?
Oh, absolutely. And that's really been our approach at GitHub since the beginning, to be a platform company. We have a lot of different components that are in there that folks can use, but we have partners like Octopus Deploy who specialize in very specific, portions of the SDLC. We are not a deployment tools. GitHub Actions is amazing. It's a great CI tool. It's the most popular one out there now. And sure, because it's a bunch of VMs that are under the hood that can run scripts, yeah, it can deploy stuff for you, but it's not monitoring those deployments. It's not doing all of the things that a deployment focused solution is going to do for someone like Octopus Deploy does. So the opportunity to be able to have a best in breed environment where those tools interact really well with one another and can provide that best experience allows for 90 to 95% of the use cases to be hit by each of those tools without having to force things in there or make it behave in a way that it wasn't really designed to in the first place.
And we've kind of taken the same approach as well. we are not an ITSM tool. We're not going to try to replace ServiceNow. We want to interact with ServiceNow, get the ITSM approvals. We're not a source code repository. We're not a build server. We want to interact with GitHub and have a GitHub app to make that a really great experience. So we have kind of the seamless transition between the two. And speaking of GitHub Actions, I'm going to move over a bit with some compliance CI with GitHub Actions. And this is kind of your area, so I'll let you take over.
So, of course, before we deploy an artifact, it's ultimately got to be built, and that's what the great thing about CI/CD is, right? We're gonna build stuff, now we're gonna make sure that we can deploy it, ideally continuously. But when we want to make sure that we can enforce compliance on the build side, there are a number of things that are built into GitHub Actions that really help out with that. So when it comes to this topic of least privilege that we've kind of been talking about here off and on for the past 25 minutes or so, one of the things that is built into GitHub Actions is the ability to require approvals for workflow changes via something like code owners. So if you have your workflow defined in the single repository itself, it's pretty straightforward to require a review from a platform engineering team or whoever the responsible party or parties are for approving changes to the build workflow by setting that up in code owners. Similarly, if you have a standardized job that you want to make sure is run across all of your applications or a significant portion of them, you can build those in as required jobs and define that in a repository rule set with, all repositories tagged with X must have Y job run. And that job that lives in a different repository that can have its own structure to it. I would personally encourage you to make sure that developers at least have read access to that repository so they can see how their stuff is being built when they send it off their machine, because that's just a polite and kind thing to do, and they really can't do anything about it, but at least they have that understanding. Of course, all of those actions need to be audited, and that's something that you're going to hear both from me and from Bob as we continue through this. And when that work is defined as a workflow in GitHub Actions, you get a couple of different levels of audit. One, because the workflow files themselves are Git repositories, you do get audit control via just Git changes. So the workflow changed at X date because a Git blame shows Y person, and we could see the unit of change. Ideally, you've done some things to that with required approval via code owners and changes via pull requests, so you can see exactly the process it went through to ultimately bring that change into the mainline branch. Then every activity that GitHub Actions performs is emitted through an event log that you can then consume into whichever your log management stack is of choice. We've got off-the-shelf integrations to things like Splunk, but we can also dump it off to an S3 bucket or an Azure Blob Store location for you to ingest into whatever tooling you prefer. Beyond that, the workflows that we're going to be kind of highlighting today, where we use things like artifact attestations to prove the provenance of the artifact, and combined with the kind of the platform capabilities and the hardening standards that we have within GitHub, really help us to get to SLSA or level 3. And for those that are looking to decode a little bit, SLSA is the supply chain levels for software artifacts. SALSA is just a really much shorter way of saying that. And ultimately, that's a set of standards that are part of the Open Source Security Foundation, which is a child project of the Linux Foundation, that define really best practices for securing artifacts. Without going too deep into the levels right now, ultimately, level 3 is that we can show provenance and that we have a hardened build system and a hardened environment all the way through that we can demonstrate back. And if you want GitHub to manage all of that build hardware for you so that we can make sure that each of those are happening in ephemeral environments without anything left over, that's just part of our hardware management standard. And we can inject that into your network via things like Azure VNet. But ultimately, all this comes down to making sure that we can prove beyond a measure of a doubt exactly who defined the change to the build workflow, when something was built, how it was built, and that it was not modified in any way from start to end. And then it ultimately gets handed off to be deployed, and that's where Octopus Deploy comes in next.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny. I won't lie. I had to look up Salsa, what is Salsa? I had to look up Salsa, SLSA, a few weeks ago because I was at a conference where they're talking about. I'm like, what the heck is this SLSA? And then it's like, no, it's pronounced salsa. I'm like, oh. And so when we get into like those different types of levels, so one of the things you kind of talked about, the who, the why, the who, the what, the why, the where, the when. That's also coming back to provenance, isn't it?
Hmm. Yep,
So
exactly.
yeah. And then, when we hand it over to the Octopus side, I do want to talk a little bit about standardization because if you're an Octopus Deploy customer already, you're probably fairly familiar with a lot of the functionality we provide. But I want to talk a little bit about some of the things that we're kind of focused in on when it comes to standardization. Now, one trend that we've seen over the past couple of years is kind of this shift towards these centralized teams, and they're responsible for everything that has to deal with the deployment side. It sort of makes sense because over the past couple of years, we've also seen the rise of digital transformations being very popular. So they're either moving to cloud or they're moving to Kubernetes. We're also seeing custom AI workloads being built, very popular, and a lot of them are running on Kubernetes. So it's kind of like you're combining two things all at once. And you have to think about what it's like for the developers because now suddenly all of this knowledge that they've previously had, they have to change because they have a whole new tool set that they've never had before. And to offload some of that work, these platform engineers or the DevOps engineers or whomever, they kind of take over and say, hey, we're going to offload some of that work for you. And so basically, you give me the artifact, and I'm going to figure out how to deploy it for you. Now, I'm kind of curious, Phil, are you kind of seeing the same thing when it comes to standardization on your side as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's certainly there's a push to more standardization, and I think what we're seeing is more and more companies trying to get away from what I'll call the one pipeline to rule them all sort of
Mm,
approach, or the kind of the single enterprise pipeline, to something that is a standardized set of those jobs that can be run while still allowing individual teams the degrees of freedom they may need within their own unique and specific application. It's kind of a how do we provide that appropriate balance between unmanageable and really hard to attest compliance with, and forcing everybody down a single huge monolithic pipeline that tries to be everything to everyone and then becomes unwieldy in its own.
yeah, I think the phrase I love to use is like if you try to build a pipeline for everyone, you build a pipeline for no one. And it's funny because one of the things we're focused in on for Octopus Deploy is this concept of what we're calling Platform Hub, where we're going to kind of provide the capability for these blueprints as well as these guardrails in place to kind of allow this, having some control, but also providing the appropriate steps to let you do that. Really, our goal is to democratize the CI/CD pipelines, where you have these concepts of producers. They're the experts in the tool. They know all the different compliance for the company and everything else. And then they're going to work with the consumers who are the experts in their applications. And ideally, they're also experts in how their application should be hosted, hopefully, but not always. And really provide this kind of set of tools for better collaboration between the two groups and kind of support both types of scenarios where there's always going to be the teams that are, we really don't care. We're just building up a bunch of microservices. It's the same thing over and over again. Now, I just want to give you the artifact. You figure out how to deploy it, to the teams that are building a bit more complex applications. And they're like, no, we want to be able to build and own our own pipeline due to the complexity that we have to worry about. And so when we get into Platform Hub, there's going to be really four key components. So we're going to have process templates, policy engine, project templates, and compliance dashboard. Now, what's nice is process templates, it's actually going to be included as part of the demonstration today. And think of them as reusable multi-step templates, or think of them like Lego building blocks for your deployment and runbook processes that you can inject into them, as well as have steps that run before or after that are custom to your particular application. And one of the things that we've really focused in on is this capability to have versioning. Um, Now, Phil, I'm not quite sure some of the things you've run across, but for us, one of the big things that we run across is that oftentimes people will create this template, but really it's just when someone uses this, they're just cloning the template. And so if you ever have to push a major change, it's a whole process on top of that.
Yeah, I mean, in the sense of trying to version a pipeline, that's definitely something we've seen folks really want to try to figure out. I won't pretend to have seen the magic answer to this, but I'm, but what you're kind of highlighting here is really a unique step. The other thing, of course, is as people start sharing out those pipelines, is what happens to a change, and does that
Yeah.
change automatically get propagated to everyone who is deployed based upon version 1 of it, or is there a process by which we have to lift every consumer up from version 1 to version 2 to make sure that it's a non-breaking change? That's one of those things that we see some people, pushing rightly or wrongly into huge monorepo type frameworks to handle
Yep.
versus trying to handle it across a portfolio of them. I still remain unconvinced that that's the right answer for a lot of approaches, but it's a problem we are seeing, and we're actively working to improve as well. I'm
Yeah.
actually looking forward to the demo of this, to your approach of it.
Yeah. This is one of those things that we kind of, because everything's going to occur within Octopus Deploy, we have a bit more control. If we're just hyper focused in on solving it for the deployment side. If we're trying to solve it for everything, I think we would kind of have this a bit more of a convoluted approach to it. But really, kind of what we're really trying to solve for is the situation where, hey, it's a bit different than just accepting a patch change. It's just a non-breaking change. Maybe you tweak the verbiage versus a minor change or a breaking change. And how are we going to handle something like that? So that's a big thing that we're kind of focused in on. How can we solve that, at least for the deployment side within our own tool set? And having process templates is great, but we also want to make sure that you actually use the process templates. And so this is where our policy engine is going to come into play. So we're building it on top, building it using Rego as the query language. As you can see, there's a sample in the top screenshot. And really the goal here is to make sure that you're compliant. And if you're not compliant, we're going to either warn you or block the deployment. It really depends on how you want to set up that particular policy. So allowing that type of functionality to make it super easy for anyone to make sure that, yes, you are compliant. And as long as you are compliant, you should have no problems. But if you're not compliant, if you try to step outside a little bit, we're going to warn you or we're going to block you. And then once that's done, we're going to build up the project templates, because it's kind of a combination of multiple things. We can template the entire project. So this is the runbooks, the deployment process, the variables, the life cycles, the environments, the whole thing, but still getting the same versioning and syncing capabilities that we saw with process templates. And then finally, our compliance dashboard. And this is where we're going to surface usage information, surface policy compliance, add exceptions, because not every application, while they should be compliant, sometimes they're just not, just due to this type of application that are being deployed. And so having that, but also surfacing that and making it super easy to give to the auditors or to whomever is asking for that type of information. So let's move on to the demo, because we've kind of teased it a little bit. I do want to kind of set the stage as to the responsibilities of each of the different tools, just to make sure that we're aware of them. I'm not going to go through all of them just because of the interest of time. And I'm just going to kind of move right into the demonstration. So I have a change ready to go. And I'm going to go ahead and save it. What the change is kind of unimportant. But what I really want to show off for that, I'm just going to go ahead and, you know what, I'm not going to create the pull request yet. I should have checked in my action. Yes. And so within my GitHub action, and this is kind of a real-time code review for Phil, um, walking through and seeing what I'm doing with this GitHub action. So the first thing I'm doing, determining versioning, running unit tests, scanning repo for vulnerabilities. This is actually going through the package.json files, because it's a .NET application, and looking for any vulnerabilities from my third-party tools. Then I create the GitHub release. Then I'm going to build, scan, and publish the website, create and publish my database, generate and publish my SBOM, generate the attestations, and then hand over to Octopus Deploy. Now, one of the things I really like about GitHub Actions is they make it super easy to run steps in parallel, but also wait at certain stages. So for example, I don't want to create the GitHub release until I do these things, nor do I want to generate my attestations until I have something to attest to. So first look, any thoughts, Phil, before we dive into the actual workflow itself?
Nah, this is exactly what we like to see from customers, and it's a great workflow. And again, in terms of being able to parallelize long running jobs and bring them back together, that's one of the great benefits of Actions. And we can see everything kind of running in sequence here. The nice thing too, I will provide links afterward around artifact attestation generation and how that gets managed and how that can contribute to achieving a compliance with the SALSA level 3 if that's something that you're interested in. But we're able to handle that all here directly in GitHub Actions, utilizing GitHub Actions is key essentially to generate those attestations. And then once it's ready for deploy, we can hand that right over. I will also say, kind of as these action steps are going, ideally all these policies that are getting checked are automated, defined by code. But if you do have things that require someone to come on in and click a button to get an approval or integrate it with a ticketing system in order for someone to get an approval, there are wait steps possible all
Hmm.
along this pipeline here as well that we have seen customers build in. I say that admittedly a bit begrudgingly because I have a strong preference for being able to automate everything and have it all defined by policy, but I recognize that not every organization is fully ready for that yet.
Yeah, absolutely. We are, if we have enough time, we're going to get into the an ITSM approval. Thankfully, I already have something already pre-approved, so no one has to watch me go ahead and do that. But that's not till the very end of this. So there's only actually 2 times where we're going to have a person take a look at any of the changes. But the other thing I do want to point out is that scanning my repo for vulnerabilities, this took 21 seconds, but my unit test took 46 seconds. So adding the capability to scan, that didn't add anything to my overall workflow runtime. And I think that's really big. It comes back to that concept of being fast and compliant. Adding these things, generating the SBOM, that didn't add anything to my overall runtime. Now, generating the attestations took 10 seconds, but we're not
Yeah,
talking minutes.
absolutely. And when we're talking about the scanning for vulnerabilities, we of course can talk about things like static analysis of the code and everything else that can get built in there as well. And that just further adds to the compliance and also the security and the things that an auditor is looking for. Have you checked every proposed change for security vulnerabilities? Have you ensured that nothing beyond a low or a medium is getting into X type environment? These are all things that can be built in and run at every single step of the way. And of course, if anything is found, we at GitHub can do things like have an AI automated code suggestion, which is kind of outside of the scope of what we're doing here, to
Yeah.
help a developer quickly heal that error so that they can move forward and not be stalled and waiting on security for findings and other things of that nature.
And I mean, we also have good old Dependabot running in the
Oh yeah,
background as well.
making sure that you aren't doing things like adding a vulnerable package.
Exactly. So I have so I'm only going to cover a couple of the steps. I don't want to cover everything because just in the interest of time as well, but running the Trivy scan vulnerability. So I'm leveraging Trivy for this, but I think what's really cool about this is I export the results right here. And then I come in here and I'm uploading those scan results to GitHub Security. And so when you come back up here, this is why you see 84 things now pop up for my security, because I uploaded these results. So I can kind of get this real-time update of any sort of vulnerabilities that I need to address, which I think is really cool. It's only took me, this is a couple steps, nothing super crazy to add this in here.
Sounds like you were using an old image.
um, I put in there to not, I put in there to not ignore unfixed.
There we
So
go.
it's like, yes, this vulnerability exists. I'm like, I know, as soon as I get the package update, I will absolutely do that. Now, when it comes to the other, I'm also using Trivy to scan my Docker containers. So I build my website container, then I scan it, and then I upload it to GitHub Security as well. And then that's actually, after I do that, that's when I'm logging into Docker Hub and pushing that Docker image. So I don't push anything up there, ideally, if it has any sort of vulnerability, kind of preventing that. Generating the SBOM, again, going back to our good friend Trivy, it can also generate SBOMs for you, super easy. And it generates this file, and then what I'm doing is I'm packaging up that file, and this is what I'm going to give to Octopus Deploy to, for as part of this SBOM ingestion, and we'll see how it's going to be used in just a second. and then I log in and I publish that up there. Now I did do something interesting, and this is the piece I'm really curious about. So I wanted to generate a single attestation for all of my build artifacts. And I'm kind of curious, what are your thoughts? Do you prefer a single attestation for all build artifacts or an attestation per artifact?
I don't know that I individually have a strong opinion on either.
Okay.
That's the type of thing where I'd want to ideally consult with my auditors and figure out, what are they looking for to be attested. I mean, as long as we have the attestation going back for ultimately the artifact that's getting deployed into production, intermediate artifacts, if they're packaged into that, to me, maybe personally not a big deal, but you know, maybe that the more is safer default would be let's attest everything.
No, that's fair.
What are your thoughts on it?
I mean, obviously you saw that what I ended up doing is of the 3 build artifacts I generated, the database
Hmm.
package, my Docker container, as well as even my SBOM, I tested to all 3 of those. And that's what this step is doing is I'm generating the hashes. I'm taking the hashes from there, adding the subjects, and then creating the single file. And then I just have a single attestation for this. And
Eh,
so go ahead.
oh, sorry, go
Sorry.
ahead.
Oh, I was going to say what it looks like when I come back up to my actions when it runs is it comes into here, and if I scroll down a bit, I can see the actual attestation. I can click on it. I get all of this information for all of my artifacts, I guess.
And as we saw, the time penalty for creating those 3 attestations was an entire 10 seconds, and they're not exactly consuming a whole lot on disk, so might as
Yeah.
well attest to everything.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and so I think it was super easy for me to add this. I think the hardest part for me was figuring out the exact format of the file, honestly. That was really it. It actually worked out super easily on that. Now, we handed over to Octopus Deploy, so I do want to go through that a bit. So this is the Octopus Deploy dashboard. This is what everyone will see when they first log in. Now, we've been building the Trident application, so I'm going to go ahead and click on that. And one of the things that we've set up in terms of rules for like, again, thinking back about FSI is that one of the rules that I have in place is that anything that's done in a feature branch can never, ever, ever make it up to production. And I do that with a couple ways. The first thing that I do is I have a separate, what I call life cycle or pipeline for feature branches. So you can see here, feature, feature, feature. And those can only go up to development. And then when I want to go up to production, then I have a rule in place where I'm only going to use something from main. So much so that if we come into channels, when I want to go up to my release, I can only use the main branch. So that's just a rule that we have in place to prevent anyone from kind of stepping outside of the bounds. Same thing, like I prevent pre-release tags of any sort of artifacts that get created. So those kind of 2 layers can definitely help out for that. And I'm going to jump into here, and we can see what the finished build, as we were talking about just a little bit ago. This is what ran. Now I'm doing a couple of things. So we're not responsible for generating the SBOM, but in my mind, we should take the SBOM and extract it and attach it as part of this deployment. So if anyone were to ask, what was the SBOM for the artifact that was deployed to this particular environment? Doesn't matter if it's development, test, or production. I'm doing it the same across the board. And I can download this SBOM, go, here it is. This is what it is. And then after that, I'm using the GitHub CLI to do my attestation verify. So verifying the attestation, and then I'm basically with the CLI, what it allows you to do is you can get the response back as JSON. So I take that response and I'm attaching these attestations as part of our deployment artifact. So I have all of these attestations. So again, I can prove this out there, as well as the database Delta report. So I get all of this information. Again, 99% of the time, it's not going to be something that will probably have, most people are going to be using in terms of day to day. But when you absolutely need it, it's better to have it and not need it than need it, not have it type of thing. And then after I do that type of work, then I go through, and this is where I'm deploying the database change, deploying the website, verifying everything, and then going from there. So it's, in my mind, it's really interesting. Now, when I do the GitHub attestation verify, What are some of the things it is actually verifying? Because that part's a little fuzzy to me. I just ran the CLI command and it said, yep, you passed attestation verification.
Yeah, so ultimately what it's doing, the CLI is generating a SHA hash using the build artifact that you have, and it uses that hash to look up the attestation. So if it's been tampered with, it's going to throw a 404 error, and we're not going to actually be able to generate that. And that's what's happening kind of ultimately underneath the hood as you're running all of those. Again, we'll make sure to share out kind of documentation to each of these steps, afterwards, so that folks can kind of dig into that a little bit more, and also grab the action that's being used and use it directly in their workflows if they wish to. One question I actually had for you in here, this is really I like this workflow here, but this workflow supposes a what I'll call a merge then deploy type approach, right? Like we're
Yeah.
going to create a bunch of features. We know that they're working on the feature branch. We merge them to main. Maybe every merge to main gets deployed. Maybe we only deploy certain commits to main at some point. But then for a rollback, or let's say you hit a bunch of exceptions in production because the environment's a little bit different than test, and you realize, hey, we got to roll back. If we're on main, using Octopus Deploy, what's my rollback strategy here, right? Like, one of the great things of being able to deploy more frequently is that ideally we de-risk ourselves and there's less demand for rollback, but we might need to at some point.
Yeah. So there's a couple things that you can do. So the first thing is if it's a code thing and you just need to go back to the previous version of the code, you can come back and you can just say, I want to redeploy this out to production, and it will go ahead and let you do something like that. Very simple, low stress way type of thing to do on something like that. But we're also adding in the capability. This is on our roadmap, where we can have feature toggles. So you can also toggle on and off particular functionality depending on the environment, depending on a number of other items that are built in there. So maybe you rolled it out and everything works except for a new feature because of some sort of
Mm-hmm.
situation. I just want to turn off that feature, because if you roll back a piece of code, there's no fine-grained approach to that. It either all rolls back or nothing rolls back. So all of the bug fixes, any security fixes, anything that went up as part of that push to production, if you roll that back, all of that comes back. And so in my mind, it really depends on what is causing that failure, and you need to have a bit of nuance as to how you want to approach something like that.
Absolutely.
Awesome. So I'm going to go ahead and create my pull request. And let's get this pushed up to test as we kind of walk through this. And then we'll get into the platform hub a little bit while we're waiting for this to build and get deployed up to our testing environment. So this went ahead and it built that for me. It went ahead and did the merging for me. And just like before, we're going to kick off 2 new actions, one for main, because now we have a completely different set of code, because I might have had 3 or 4 feature branches, might have a bunch of different merges, and I want to rebuild main, because that's the thing that I want to test and verify in my test environment. And that's what's going to go up to production on something like that. Awesome. So let's get over into our deployment process really quick, and because I want to talk a little bit about the process templates. So let's hide the notes. And let's talk primarily about this verify build artifacts process template, because I think that's kind of the highlight for our FSI audience today. So the verifying the build artifacts, from a consumer point of view, I actually don't really need to know how it attaches the SBOM to the release or how the attestation verification occurs. What I just need to do is I need to provide it some parameters on how it's going to work, and then it's going to take care of the rest for me. So from a consumer point of view, we really try to reduce the amount of friction, the amount of knowledge. And in fact, a future version, I'm going to be removing that parameter to make it even easier. But then it also comes into the settings. And so we kind of talked a little bit about this when it came to the template versioning, where we can accept patches, accept minor changes. Now, imagine if I am, for example, having a pretty big production push, or I'm doing a webinar. Now, I might only want to be able to accept patches, and let because I know those going to be non-breaking changes. But any sort of minor change or major change that breaks things, I want to be able to review and accept where appropriate, and do it in my own time. So maybe today is not the best time because I'm doing a webinar, but tomorrow or next week is a better time on something like that. And so what I can do is, if I come over to Platform Hub, and this is a new feature, this is a new area that we're adding into Octopus Deploy, and then we can come into our process template. And if I wanted to, I can make a fairly innocuous change. So attach the SBOM to the release. I can come in here and I can just add is extracted is this value. Very simple, dumb change. And then what I can do is I can commit this and I can just say demo update. I can go ahead and click on next. And then I can make the determination of what kind of change this is. Now, for the purposes of this demonstration, I'm going to make it a minor change just so you can kind of see what this is like. And then I can go ahead and click on done. And what this has done is this will now take the change that I've just done, and now it's going to publish it out to all of the consumers. And I can control which, what we call spaces, has the capability to see these particular templates. So I can share this to all spaces. I can share this to selected spaces, however I want to do something like that. So if I come back into our deployment and click on the process, verify the build artifact, I can see here that a new version is now available. I'm currently using this old version, and it says these errors may have changed. It's something you should know about. And I can just say, go ahead and click on update to a new template. And I go ahead and do that. Now, what's nice about this is only going to happen when I create a new release, like that latest template is going to be used. And as you can see, I can't check directly into main. I need a pull request to do something like that. So, oh, it's not gonna, it's not going to like that. If I got a little bit too excited, I did too much all at once. So I'm going to go ahead and discard those changes. Discard the changes, it's fine. And then medium code scan, update to a new template. Okay, now we're good to go. Demo update. And go ahead and commit this as well. And so now, this is now going to be part of that pull request that we just created just a little bit ago. So now everything is part of that. And so that's just kind of the way that we can handle any sort of these types of changes like that. Awesome. So now it's pushing up to test, and this should go through pretty quickly. Now, I guess, as you kind of see some of these different changes, Phil, I guess I'm kind of curious if you have any additional thoughts that you'd want to share.
I think that, as going back to what we talked about a little bit earlier, this again provides multiple paths toward the attestation of process. We highlighted in the beginning, and I highlighted the ability of actions and the fact that it's backed by a Git repo and has all the other audited events and controls to show essentially multiple checks and multiple ways to demonstrate how a particular change to the build step is in place. And then, of course, Octopus Deploy is doing the exact same thing over here with the deploy side, right? We just saw that you update the template, have a pull request that's going to have a Git commit associated with it, and that update to the template here. Of course, emitting that to the same audit log. So we're providing multiple data points really for each of these changes, so that we can confidently share back with an auditor or whomever else wants to see evidence of our process. And that is ultimately really key, and that's a great way about having this all backed by code as well.
Yeah, everything that you've seen here today is all stored in this repository, this Bob J. Walker Trident repository. So if you want to see the action, you can also see the actual deployment process, what it looks like, everything else in between on something like that. We've had a couple questions come through around the feature toggles. Are feature toggles snapshotted into a specific deployment, i.e. release into an environment? No, they're not. The kind of feature toggles sit outside of the snapshot with the intention that you'll have the capability to turn them on or turn them off. So because when you add a feature toggle, you also have to make a corresponding code change for that. So that really is kind of the snapshot part of it. And it's built on top of Open Feature, as I saw some of the other comments come through on that. Awesome. And then this should wrap up pretty quickly. I don't know if we're going to be able to get to the actual pushing up to production, but what it would look like when we want to create that, it would actually require, we can actually see what that looks like if I wanted to redeploy this, for example. Because this is a protected environment, so test wasn't protected, development wasn't protected, but production is protected. This is a setting that we have set up in terms of our environments. Come in here really quickly, show you what that looks like, where we can say this particular environment is change controlled. Click on edit. This is change controlled. So what happens is now when I want to deploy up to production, I can provide it a change request number if I already had a previously existing change request number. And if I don't, it will automatically be created for us. And then we can go into the ServiceNow interface and do all that work where appropriate. So yeah, just interest of time, I know we're hitting up against that limit. So again, high level overview, how we can help auditing and compliance. Walk through each of these things where we can improve auditability and reduce risks through a best-in-breed CI/CD pipeline. Help provide enterprise standardization of processes, increased traceability, and reduce manual reporting, remove manual steps to increase efficiency, and overall, we want to improve the DevOps by removing friction from the process and building trust. So ran through that really quick, but thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you, Phil, for joining us. I really appreciate your time and your insights.
Thanks for the opportunity. And as always, if you've got any questions, feel free to reach out to us over at GitHub or Bob and company over at Octopus, and we'd be happy to dive in further with you.
Absolutely. And then selfishly, I'm going to promote one last thing. I just released a new blog post. It just was published today. Supply chain security with GitHub Actions and Octopus Deploy. Pretty much everything that we just talked about. This is the written word version of this particular webinar. So please feel free to dive through it. I go through all the actions, walk through all the different pieces for this. Awesome.